Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tech Talks, our virtual speaker series focused on technology ethics. My name is Kirsten Martin. I'm a professor of technology ethics and the director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center. I'm filling in for our regular host, Elizabeth Reneris, founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab. And we are very happy to welcome you to our fourth Tech Talk of the semester in a series focused on technology and power. In this series, we are examining how the speed and breadth of technological advancement often replicates historical and systemic racism, discrimination, and inequalities in employment, education, healthcare, financial services, criminal justice, and virtually every aspect of modern life. We also look at how individuals and entities with the power and resources to develop and deploy new technologies generate massive financial, social, and political capital, while marginalized members of society are often excluded from their benefits or even made to bear the brunt of their harms. We are joined by leading academics, practitioners, and activists who explore questions such as who reaps the benefits of new technologies and who suffers the harms or consequences, how is technology reshaping or reinforcing existing power dynamics in society, including the respect to gender and race, and can technology distribute power more equitably, and if so, how? So we examine these issues in relation to bias and power. While algorithms and AI are often touted as neutral, unbiased decision-making tools, these technologies rarely perform equally well across all populations and demographics. And the impacts of these performance differences have far-reaching consequences in the workplace and court and even online dating pool. Join us as we explore the industrial, legal, ethical, cultural, and social implications of this research with Dr. Ifeoma Ajunwa and Dr. Apryl Williams. First, I'll introduce both. A longer introduction is on the website for Inside ND Tech or Inside ND, and I'll have an abbreviated version, but both are well accomplished. First, Dr. Ajunwa is a tenured law professor at the University of Carolina School of Law and an adjunct associate professor at the Kenan-Flagler School of Business, where she is a Rethink Labs Fellow. She is also the founding director of the AI Decision-Making Research Program at UNC Law. Dr. Ajunwa is a 2019 recipient of the NSF Career Award and a 2018 recipient of the Derek Bell Award from the Association of American Law Schools. Dr. Ajunwa's research interests are at the intersection of law and technology, with a particular focus on the ethical governance of workplace technologies. Her research focuses on diversity and inclusion in the labor market and in the workplace. Dr. Ajunwa's forthcoming book, The Quantified Worker, examines the role of technology in the workplace and its effects on management practices as moderated by employment law, and will be published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Ajunwa's scholarly articles have been published in both top law review and peer review publications. She has been invited to testify before US Congress, government agencies such as the CFPB, the EEOC, and has served as a keynote speaker at several national and international conferences. She's a contributor to Forbes, and her writing has also been published in other media such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, The Atlantic, the ACLU blog, and on. We are also joined by Dr. Apryl Williams. Dr. Williams is jointly appointed as an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media and the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. Her research interests converge at the intersection of popular culture, internet culture, race, gender, and technology. Williams uses a Black feminist lens to probe the intersection of body size and race in online identity movements across digital platforms. Her research draws on critical cultural theory, media studies scholarship, and sociological perspectives to explore the growing acceptance of body positivity and concurrent counter-narratives. Williams' research has been published in leading interdisciplinary journals such as Social Media in Society, Information Communication in Society, the International Journal of Communication, and the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. She also serves as a series editor of Emerald Studies in Media and Communications, where she has co-edited 5 books on aspects of digital culture, such as international media flows, digital inequalities, and digital publics. Williams is also serving as a guest editor for a special issue on digital life and COVID-19. Her research has also been covered in Time Magazine, Slate, NPR's On Media, The Guardian, and other notable popular communication outlets. In addition to her appointment NDIS and ND Tech here at Notre Dame, she was recently co-awarded Mississippi State University's Research to Advance Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity and Access Grants Program to study the impact of privatized surveillance on communities of color in the US. Dr. Williams is also a faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and an affiliated researcher at NYU's Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. Ifeoma and Apryl, thank you so much for being here today to discuss bias and power. I'll lead us in a discussion and we also can have questions from the audience. I'm hoping to have an interactive discussion with you. I think it's so interesting how both of you have such interdisciplinary backgrounds and in practice, like you're both co-appointed at different places within your universities. your research is across different disciplines. So you like in your home discipline, but also in other journals and outlets to kind of get a broader audience. And your background is interdisciplinary. You both come from different areas. So I wanted to start at a higher level, that what brought you from your own perspectives to fairness, discrimination, and ethics of AI. As Apryl notes, I like this quote: consistently, the outcomes of machine learning reflect, reproduce, and amplify structural inequalities. And you both study this in different areas, one online and Ifeoma a lot in the workplace. And I actually find that so unique because I don't think there's enough going on within organizations to talk about workers. You come from different areas such as law school and a sociologist, but arrived studying similar things. And I was hoping you could just take briefly as how you got to this point from your own discipline. And Apryl, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so for me, I think so much of it has to do with the way that these technologies impact our everyday lives. For me, I came into this because I was acutely aware of how algorithms sort of govern the online dating process. And there was so much, and there still is so much about them that we don't know what they're doing with our data and how they structure our data and how we see who we see on those platforms. And I think it's really important to sort of just understand exactly what's happening in the background, but there's also so much that they're doing to make sure that we don't know exactly what's happening in the background. So as I think about that in relation to other areas of society, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, there's so much of our lives that are structured and constrained by algorithms that really drives me to think about, well, what does it mean when we say things are fair or not fair? Who is constructing that idea of fairness? And what does it mean that the people who are making policy about what is fair at these companies at the high level are mostly white men and making them for decisions for people who are not mostly white? So I think that that's really problematic. And that's where I like to sort of take both a technological perspective, but also a cultural studies perspective to understand how we situate ourselves and our own identities within these larger power structures.
That's super helpful. So like it's almost started from the phenomenon of the user experience of like, what is the user experiencing and how are they being shaped by this technology? And then backing into, so what's going on? Like who's doing this and asking questions from that. Ifeoma, if you could speak a little bit about how you got to what you study now, like almost your trajectory from all the places you've been.
Yes, so I would say that I'm actually an accidental technologist, like I'm an accidental law and technology scholar. I am an anti-discrimination scholar in all my areas of research, but the law and tech side specifically actually came out of the work that I was doing as a doctoral candidate at Columbia University, where I was studying reentry of the formerly incarcerated. I was really concerned about the mass incarceration crisis, and especially as to what was happening to the people who had served time, been released, and still were having trouble really reintegrating into society, particularly when it came to the labor market. And in interviewing these men and women, one refrain was, "I hate computers." And at first I took this to mean something like, oh, I'm not computer literate, and therefore I find it challenging to work in the digital space. But actually they were telling me something different, it turned out, which is that they felt that automated hiring platforms were actually being deployed to exclude them from the labor market or from the workplace. So they felt that instead of being able to go into any place of work, or most of these people were applying for retail positions. So instead of being able to go into any major retailer and hand in the application in person, speak with the manager, explain themselves, talk about their rehabilitation efforts, they were forced to apply online and then would not ever hear back. So for me, I thought this was a very interesting tension where, we sort of conceive of digital technologies as democratizing, right? We think of them as creating opportunities, opening up spaces to the masses, so to speak. But here was a situation where a digital technology was actually being used to exclude So that actually led me to want to study automated hiring platforms, and then even go beyond that to also start looking at wearable technologies in the workplace and the manner in which those technologies could also be used for discriminatory purposes.
That's so interesting because that I like the idea of being the accidental law and technology person, only because it shows how no matter where you are, in what area of the company or what area of academia, that the issues around tech ethics will find you. No matter where you think you're doing something like re-entry programs, you're not thinking law and technology, that you're at the cutting edge, and yet and then you're confronted with this, and so I think it goes to the idea, one, about how important interdisciplinary work is, which is both of you are doing, because you really have to understand the issues around tech ethics, but then speak about it within your home discipline to say, okay, when we're talking about employment, this is how we talk about employment. And if I'm talking to a company, this is how we think about it. If we're talking about online dating platforms, this is how we have to think about this. This is the positive and negative impact that you're having on people. That's I like the idea of being accidental. So I want to get a little bit into each of your work. So Apryl, I'll start with you and your recent paper on algorithmic reparations, which is nicely titled Algorithmic Reparation. And I always like a good title. So you start by addressing this idea of fair machine learning, which I really liked because it's often operationalized in practice as fairly technical and focused on these measurements of equity and parity, which are so unsatisfying for people that actually talk about fairness and equity, either in society or as decision making, because that's not how we usually think about it. It's just parity. But it's easy to operationalize. But for people who care about fairness, this is really unsatisfactory. And as you note, the measures often fall short. But you, with co-authors of Jenny Davis and Michael Yang, recommend including algorithmic reparation as a solution. Could you explain the idea and kind of how you see it as being important for us to start thinking about algorithmic reparation?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I want to say that the paper was published briefly for about a day. And we noticed that some of the corrections we had made during the proofing stage did not actually get integrated. And so it is still being held in academic purgatory. So if you are frantically Googling right now, which I hope you are, if you're Googling right now trying to find the paper, you won't be able to find it, but it will be out very soon. It was accepted by Big Data and Society. And we're actually putting together a workshop to test the feasibility of the framework that we lay out in the paper. And we're going to be hosting that next year in September at the University of Michigan, and co-hosted with Indy Tech and the Berkman Center and a lot of other folks. So please do stay tuned, shameless plug here, for information about the workshop. So essentially what we are arguing is that the standard way that the industry sort of broadly thinks about what is fair is largely rooted in myths of meritocracy. And so if we're using these standards such as calibration or parity to sort of get at the underlying unfairness, then we're always going to fail because society is fundamentally unfair and unjust. And so we say, instead of a fair machine learning approach, we really need to do away with the whole concept of fairness, just trash the whole thing, start over from scratch. So we argue that the idea of fairness in itself is coming from this ethos of algorithmic idealism, which is, again, rooted in these myths of meritocracy, because even as fair machine learning processes try to neutralize demographic disparities, often they do so in a way that actually highlights them and then redoubles those existing inequalities. An example that we talk about in the paper and that I like to point to often is the case of Amazon, because it's such an easy one to sort of see where they went wrong. And so I'll take a few seconds just to briefly go over that. So what they did is they knew that their hiring practices were biased, and they said, we're going to develop a fair machine learning system to make sure that we're getting more diversity in our hiring pool. And so they built an AI system to sort of neutralize, right? They took the approach of neutralizing gender disparities. But the problem is that they had trained their data, their AI system, on the company's 10 years of previous data, which of course was all majority overwhelmingly men. And so no matter how many times they tried to recalibrate their system, the system was always disqualifying women or femme-identified people, even with markers that they hadn't programmed it with. It was seeking out proxies. So if you went to a women's university or college, or if you use quote unquote feminized language, these kinds of things, the system would say, oh, this person has these gender markers and therefore is a less desirable candidate for us to hire. And so eventually they just got rid of it altogether because that idea, that approach to fairness failed completely because they were trying to neutralize these demographic differences without actually addressing the underlying disparity, the gender disparity in tech and in broader society. And so instead of a fairness approach, we actually argue for a reparative approach, which works at both the systemic level, but then also actually at the level of code. So instead of a code that would neutralize gender, it would actually seek out gender and optimize it. So that if we take this Amazon example, for example, we would say, okay, people with different genders, alternative to the mainstream male or man presenting gender, right? Are actually going to get a plus in the system. So not only are we going to look at it, but we're actually going to bump them up in the system. And so that way the code would actually elevate them and would seek out and name diversity or diverseness, whatever that looks like, as a positive in the system rather than just another treatment.
That's interesting. I've seen, it reminds me of, I'll try to remember, we'll put it in the notes, somebody at UCLA that was trying to do something similarly. Well, they were just trying to figure out how to do it with like a compass, like in the criminal justice system. And they were trying to go back, look at the data and try to make it so it was like historically was fair. And they were trying to like saying, the question was, should we just knock out a certain percentage of Black convictions, you know, from the 80s and 90s, because we just know that it was so disparate in its impact and the treatment that we can't fix that. We have to fix the data if we're going to train it on that data, which is a different way of weighting, would be another way of doing it as well. But this idea of, instead of, what I liked about it was this idea that not just trying to go, how could we just repeat what we did in the past, but faster, which if you're, that's always the question, are you better or worse than what you did before? And it might be like, well, we shouldn't just get parity with what we did before and do it quickly. We might want to think about trying to actually improve what we did before. And do it in a reparative way. That's great. Ifeoma, I wanted to, you guys are both talking about similar things in this way, and I'm sure the Amazon example resonated with you, but you looked at discrimination and auditing for automated hiring and this idea of the auditing imperative. And I love this essential idea that the automation of hiring both facilitates and obfuscates employment discrimination, which I think, and the way that you explain that it's kind of a double whammy. So it's facilitating the discrimination and then hiding it at the same time, which makes it so much harder for us to kind of peel back and figure out what's going on. So it's doing double the harm in many ways. And this is further hidden, it make it worse, not just the obfuscation of having it be through AI and people not being able to query it as easily, but then you have this issue of intellectual property law, which adds this further veil on top when people declare that you can't know it because it's a trade secret or something along those lines. Could you say a little bit more about the state of automated hiring and the issues, and then the solution around an auditing imperative?
Yes. So that's really the latest iteration of the work I'm doing on automated hiring. So the third or the second in a series of papers that I'm writing, there are 3 papers total. So I guess I'll start with the first paper, which I call The Paradox of Automation as Anti-Bias Intervention. And it's really just engaging with what I see is many employers being cognizant, right, that they do have a skewed workplace or that they do have historical bias in their employment decisions, and actually wanting to be better and thinking that automated hiring platforms are a way to be better, that they are actually an anti-bias intervention because they have created sort of this binary where automated decision-making is seen as somehow separate and better than human decision-making. So in that first paper, I really sort of make the point that you can't really disentangle automated decision-making from human decision-making. It's not possible to do that because automated decision-making, even in employment, is still very reliant on human decision-making. So humans are making decisions about how to define the models used for the algorithms. They're making decisions as to the training data. Dr. Williams talked a little bit about the training data and how that can already come tainted with bias. So obviously humans are making a decision whether to just use that training data, even if they know that it is tainted already with bias. And then humans are also making decisions how to interpret the results of the automated decision-making. So my point with that paper really is that the human hand remains ever present, even in automated decision-making for hiring. And then the second paper then makes the point that given that we know, right, that there is this potential for there to be bias in automated hiring, even with best intentions, that actually creates a duty on the part, a legal duty on the part of the employer to audit the automated hiring systems that they choose to deploy. And the question, of course, is where is this legal duty derived from? I argue that it's actually derived from American anti-discrimination law, specifically Title VII. So Title VII, when it was passed, was a legislative attempt to correct historical discrimination. So that's actually written into the legislative history of Title VII, that it is meant to correct the fact that for so many years, there had been racial and other types of discrimination de jure, right, allowed by law in the workplace. So Title VII was meant to correct that. So if Title VII is meant to correct that, then it's not merely enough for employers to say, we're not going to do anything overtly discriminatory, right? That actually still confers on them a duty to check that the practices that they are deploying are not contributing to the problem, right, that Title VII is trying to correct for. I just want to give a few examples of exactly how automated hiring systems can, as you know, both facilitate and obfuscate, right, discrimination. Because I think sometimes it's really hard for people to wrap their minds around that because they think, well, this is an algorithm, it's, objective, like that word for computer systems, forgetting, of course, computer systems are still created by humans who are not objective and who are not impartial. But I just want to describe two mechanisms really that, allows bias to enter and be amplified in automated hiring systems. So one is what I call platform authoritarianism. And I write about this in my Paradox of Automation as Anti-Bias Intervention paper. So it's really the idea that job applicants, when they're engaging with an automated hiring system, they're doing so precisely under the terms of the automated hiring system. So it's not an equal relationship, right? The power is skewed towards the automated hiring system. What do I mean by that? It means if you try to apply for a job online, you have to input whatever information the system requires of you. You don't get to select, you don't get to say, no, I don't want to input that information, because most hiring systems are designed in such a way that you cannot actually complete the application unless you have divulge exactly the information they are asking of you. So one example is a man in Illinois actually wrote to the Attorney General noting that an automated hiring system he had encountered had asked him for his college graduation year. However, when he went to the drop-down menu to enter his actual accurate year, that year was not there. That year, right? The menu had cut off after a certain year. So that's platform authoritarianism. That's basically saying, we're going to essentially require this information of you. If you don't have it, tough luck. If you don't meet really are embedded biases of who should be applying for this job, tough luck, right?
Mhm.
So, and when you think about it, this is also the use of a proxy variable, right? So in automated hiring systems, you can see the use of proxy variables, which is really a covert way to enact discrimination, right?
Mhm.
So a proxy variable is basically a variable that on its face does not look discriminatory, but it's so highly correlated to another variable that is discriminatory that it might as well be the same variable, right? So for example, college graduation date is highly correlated with age in the United States. So asking for a college graduation date is a little bit of a sneaky way, right? A covert, obfuscating way to really ask for the age of the applicant. And there are other examples. For example, some automated hiring platforms also ask for zip codes. Well, in the United States, right, with its history of residential segregation, we know that zip codes are correlated to race, highly correlated to race. So that also could perform as a proxy variable for race. So I just wanted to share those, little ways that automated hiring systems can, obfuscate discrimination. And then this then, for me, is what creates an auditing imperative. And for me, the auditing imperative means that when an employer is using an automated hiring system, the law should mandate that that employer conduct audits on the automated hiring system to check for bias and then also to correct for bias. And this can be internal audits or this can be external audits. And I definitely have a lot to talk about more in terms of what the audits could look like, but I don't want to take up all the space, and I wanted this to be a conversation.
No, I think this is great. I think that what I like about it also is anytime we get to try to make the kind of a grounding within the existing law framework and existing kind of what the market already demands, even so it's not law, it's just the market or what else happens even without technology, is it helps businesses kind of understand, well, when else would we actually deploy an employment decision-making tool? Or like, let's just say it was a rubric on a piece of paper that you handed out to all of your HR folks about when you're hiring, or if you're insurance claim adjudicator, you handed it out on paper and you said, okay, don't take anyone over this, graduation date. Like if you wrote that all down, you would be held responsible for it. And just because we design it into code doesn't mean we're not still responsible for it. So it's still a decision that the organization is making, whether it's, online algorithms sorting users or online algorithms sorting employment folk, like people applying. It's still a business decision, and we used to just do it by hand. And so I like that idea. The other idea that I think will work also well with Apryl's is, more recently you've talked about this paradoxical black box, which is interesting because you highlight, which we think about this. And so in privacy, we think about this all the time. We think about the asymmetries of how much the organization knows about me. And I've written about this versus what I know about the organization. We usually don't have that type of asymmetry in the marketplace. Like that's actually odd. We have alliances and joint ventures to ensure that when we give too much information to somebody, that there is actually a protective veneer around it to make sure they don't use that information against us. But I was just talking about users, but you have that idea within the organization. Am I getting that right?
Yes. So, I think one of my papers actually was pushing this idea that we should think of job applicants as consumers, because under American law, we actually have more protections for consumers than we do for workers.
Yes.
Vis-a-vis the collection of information, right? Vis-a-vis the sort of data that can be extracted, right? So, one of my papers, which is a paradox of automation as anti-bias intervention, I talk about the Fair Credit Report Act, right? And this is a very big protective law for consumers, where if you apply for a loan, right, if you apply for credit, all the information that is, acquired about you and used to make that decision, you have a right to see. You have a right to examine it for errors, right? You have a right to also request the correction of any errors. We don't have that for job applicants currently, although we should, because the Fair Credit Report Act doesn't actually limit itself to loans or credit. It actually says any economic decision.
Oh.
Well, a job is an economic decision, whether you get a job or not. So my argument is actually, why are we not using FICRA when it comes to job applicants? We should actually start seeing job applicants who are using automated hiring platforms more as consumers of those automated hiring platforms, and therefore applying the same FICRA protections to them, such that when you apply for a job, through Monster or Career Builder or any of those systems, and you're denied, then you should then also be privy to all the information, right, that Monster has built on you or Career Builder has built on you that was used in that process of decision making, so that you can examine it, right, for errors or also for bias, right, to see if there were, information about you that were really proxy variables and maybe should not have been used. So that's one of my arguments there.
That's great. I hadn't, until we started talking, I had not realized that both of you, and I'll go to you next, Apryl, is that both of you study an area where, and I'll just talk with my business school hat on, we in businesses don't see them as actually primary stakeholders. So when even stakeholder theory, which is thought of to be this operating theory of the firm of who should count, who really matters, right? And the primary ones, and I'll rattle them off. I studied under like the guy that did this, Ed Freeman. So it's like, consumers, suppliers, it's standard, stockholders, employees, current employees with whom we have a contractual obligation, and communities. But both of you talk about users for Apryl, and then with you, and also and also like pre-employment, like we in business schools don't consider people applying for a job a key stakeholder because they don't have a relationship with us yet. They're potential stakeholders, but they're just kind of on the periphery, like the community. Same with users, because we don't actually have a financial relationship with them. And I realize now that both of you are studying people with whom even a business ethicist in our little theories that we have don't normally even see them in our standard business ethics. I think they count, but in our standard text, we don't actually see them as primary because we're so focused on economic exchanges as defining. And like this reminded me of your work, Apryl, with the idea that technology may offer actually a tool, a positive impact. So I noticed a theme throughout your work of it not only identifying where technology is being harmful, or in the example of fairness and parity, where our fixes might be actually exacerbating the problem, but offering a way, just like the reparative idea with fairness, offering actually technologies and examining how are they actually making a positive impact and how could they make a positive impact. So in some ways, a lot of ethicists are looking at tech ethicists are saying, would you please stop doing damage? And you're saying, okay, I'm not, that's nice that you want them to stop doing damage. I actually would like them to do a little bit more than that. And I would actually make a call for actually emphasizing the good. And your recent example on discrimination in Black social media use, sites of oppression and expression, that you argue that social media may be an additional outlet for coping with the negative effects of discrimination, meaning that this is a way of people are coming together and has a positive impact on the community. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that paper, but also just this general idea that we should look for technology as having a positive impact, or ask more of technology companies that they need to think about making a positive impact. And it really reminded me again, which you mentioned, but you may want to talk more about that idea, the workshop that you have next year, where you're actually going to have people like code the next day, so this idea of very practical, very focused on positive impact. Sorry, that was a lot of questions all at once.
Yes, it was, but that's okay. I wrote them all down. So the first thing I wanted to sort of talk through was this idea of users and business exchange. For me, and where I sit in studying these technologies in dating in particular, it's like the users are your primary business concern as these companies. And so it frustrates me deeply that we as users don't have any way of holding them accountable when they are making money off of us. We
Yeah.
are the primary consumer and our data drives their business. And so we have a right as the consumer to know what's happening with our data, how they're operationalizing our data, and how they are using it to generate what they think we want, right? Like they are collecting all this information based on our face or our physical features, and specifically in dating technologies, to then feed back to us information about desirable candidates. But of course, they're basing what they believe to be desirable on first the like larger mainstream culture of desirability, which is built to serve a heteronormative white audience, but then also can be based on our own physical features. And of course, if you don't lie within that white mainstream standard of desirability, then you might be shown prospective partners that are not a good match for you based on the fact that they think that you are not attractive, right? Or that you are not desirable. And so for me, that's like fundamentally an issue. And the fact that these platforms don't disclose that, I think is very alarming. And the fact that we as the general public don't realize that that's what's happening is very frustrating. And so I think certainly there's a place to think through business ethics of that relationship and sort of like the black box paradox there, and what's happening with our data. And then I wanted to come back to this idea of thinking through reparative systems and what we can do to optimize technology for good. And the key argument that we make in our paper is that in some situations, the reparative action is to not use machine learning systems, right? I have a colleague, Kendra Albert, who writes often about gender and how AI are increasingly being used to determine gender or to assess gender or think about gender. And in the way that we think about it in sociology is that you cannot tell someone what their gender is. Gender is an avowed category. It's not ascribed, or at least it shouldn't be ascribed. It's something that everyone chooses for themselves and chooses how they express for themselves. And so an algorithm or a machine should not be able to say this person falls into X gender category. It just simply isn't appropriate. And so the reparative action is to say, we're not going to use a machine learning algorithm to determine someone's gender. And as we are coming into the space where I hope that we can have more of these conversations, I think it's also important for us to really think about how technologies have in the past been used for good. I think often people who study these sort of get depressed, right? We get sucked into it and we're like, oh, this is horrible. Where is our agency in this? How do we continue to use these technologies to get free? And I do think that it's really important to acknowledge that there have been in the past, and we can continue to use these technologies and tech spaces to usher in more freedom for people. And that's really what that paper is about. Sites of what is it? I have it here. Sites of expression and discrimination, right? This is the one that's in sociology of race and ethnicity.
Right.
And we're taking a sociology of health perspective to look at how people cope with everyday microaggressions. And they actually turn to social media to do that. And so essentially we're arguing that every day people of color encounter microaggressions. These accumulate and have a cumulative bad health effect for people, especially their mental health. And because of Black Twitter, because of communities on Facebook, on Instagram, on Tumblr, on TikTok, people now have these spaces to actually come together and commune and debrief and talk about what it looks like and feels like to exist in white spaces in Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous bodies. Especially in the US, really globally, we're seeing these people and communities all over the globe where they're saying, okay, I live in a space that is not built for me and is not built for me to thrive. And yet I can find community and talk about ways that I can thrive and push through anyway. And we actually find that people who commune with others like them more regularly do have better mental health outcomes. And that's something that we didn't have in the past where, or maybe it was more local, right? We had these smaller institutions locally where you were limited to the folks that are around you. But now I think we're seeing more of a global community come together because we are able to communicate and see, oh, actually what is happening in your country is the same thing that's happening here, just with different actors. And so we're able to have a more global conversation around oppression, and that's pushing us forward.
That's really, because what's interesting is it would almost by definition, if before you got your, the people that you could vent to and talk about what it was like to be a minority in a majority space, or of any gender or race or ethnicity. And by definition, if you're a minority in a majority space, you don't have as many people to talk to, right? So if you're counting on the physical encounters, and that's where having an online community is even more important, because you may be the only whatever in a university or at an organization. And so you have no one on a day-to-day basis to turn to. You can call your friends, but it's a lot easier to post something and then have a whole bunch of people say, oh my gosh, this just happened to me last week as well. I hate it. You know what I mean? Like, so it almost becomes more and more important and would allow people to feel better about being a minority in a majority space. So that's and also a good reminder that it can be used for good. We tend to focus on, recommending an insurrection, but it also can recommend friend groups that are extremely helpful. So we have to always remember that as well. So I want to just, since I have you both here and you both are familiar, both of you in each of your papers totally separately have, and this is like talked about like, well, the field is going a little wrong in this area. We don't need to do this. Let's focus in another direction and kind of take a given concept and move in a different direction. And I just wanted to hear from you both in this area, just generally around fairness, discrimination, and AI, where you think we as researchers are making mistakes perhaps, or maybe going in a direction that we'd be better off, shifting and going somewhere else, but also kind of where we might be doing well, where you kind of want the field to be going, where you see promise or the next area of either theory development, but also in like an industry or a practice that you think needs more attention. But I'll start with first the frustration. So what frustrates you in the area of fairness and machine learning, or even broadly ethics of AI? Where do you see us going in the wrong direction, possibly leading industry astray? I was reminded of the limited idea of fairness, but also the idea of focusing on automated video interviewing, which, I mean, now that you mentioned that you're accidental to law and technology, the field of employment is just so rife with being automated. It's kind of, you couldn't avoid it. But there could be other areas. So where do you see us going astray? Ifeoma, I'll start with you and then April.
So I guess when it comes to looking at ethics and technology, part of what can sometimes frustrates me is sort of a focus on technical fairness. I guess I'll say that for lack of a better word, which is this idea of, well, let's just focus on what exactly the automated system is doing. And maybe if we do this little tweak or that little tweak, we can make the algorithm better. We can make the model better. And for me, that's, really, it's really a techno-solutionist bent that I think really misses the bigger picture. For me, I would like to see a more sort of holistic take, which is like, for example, the Amazon case, like what does it reflect back to us about how our society is? Not just like, how can we make the algorithm better, but what does it say about how maybe women are being excluded from computer engineering? What does it say about how employers are maybe missing the boat in finding the women that do exist in computer engineering? So, I really want there to be this more expansive solutionist view as opposed to just a narrow focus on techno-solutionism. Another thing I would say also, and this is less of a frustration and more of a vision, let's say, right? More of what I would like to see more of. And that's really in the same vein of what Dr. Williams was speaking on, which is thinking about how to use technology for good, right? So as academics, we're very trained to be hypercritical, and we can really, highlight problems, spot problems and describe issues. I'd like to see more of also finding practical solutions, not just related, as I repeat again, in technological solutions, but in wider societal solutions. So thinking about how the technologies that we do have, how the capabilities can now actually be turned towards the societal good. So I write about this actually in my latest paper, which is looking at how governmental agencies can make use of automated decision-making tools themselves to actually better regulate technologies, right? To actually better regulate AI technologies. And I focus specifically on the EOC, so that hiring aspect. So one argument I make is that, for example, the EOC could itself be an auditing entity for automated hiring systems. So instead of just letting employers do their own internal auditing or relying on some external body, the EOC could itself develop an auditing tool and deploy that. And then, just thinking about also the consumer protection angle, similarly, the FTC could do the same, right? Where it can actually develop its own automated hiring audit systems. So just really this idea of, let's move away from techno-solutionism, right? But let's also not just be sort of wallowing in techno-skepticism or techno-fatalism, but be what I like to call techno-realist, which is technology is a tool. It can be used for bad. It can also be used for good. And let's think more creatively about ways to use it for good.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Apryl, things that kind of frustrate you right now, or you think we need to shift away from, and which direction we need to go to?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really the focus on, or just like sort of running ethos, in that these tweaks the things that we're suggesting, right, won't impact a majority of users. That frustrates me more than anything. As I've been in conversations with different companies over the past few years in a consulting role and saying, okay, these things that you're doing are harming marginalized populations. They tend to say that these are edge cases, right? And I have another colleague, Afsana Rigo, who is doing great work around theorizing how tech companies can more directly care for and reduce harm for the so-called edge cases. And I just think that my biggest frustration is getting them to realize that we're not edge cases. And then even that framing around talking about us as edge cases really highlights how marginalized we are. That if these companies are thinking about us as edge cases or users on the margins, or people who don't matter, then of course they don't have any incentive to change. And I'm hoping that they can actually see that we're not just edge cases, we actually make up a huge case of their user base. And so if they're not serving us, they're really not serving a lot of people, and our opinions and our experiences do matter. So I think for me, that is my biggest area of frustration in this area of work.
Yeah, that I wrote down edge cases. It's like a title that's waiting to happen is like, who is the edge case? So who like just even the framing of it. And I mean, first of all, like why do you consider them edge? Like why are you okay with them are they edge because you don't understand them? Or is it edge because there's too few? But we usually don't like to think about just because there's too few of somebody that we don't need to worry about them. So it's just, but to your point, I think that, like, I used to always say that about just the general use of the automation is that it by definition works for like 80%, and that's all they got to hit. I mean, like, so it excludes people that don't fit in the circle, whatever that circle was. And so that's just the nature of using the tool. And so we just need to think of how bad is an outlier to how much do we want to penalize the model for actually having outliers? Do we force it to bring everybody in? I mean, those are actually modeling decisions that you would make as a computer scientist that are super important. So that's a good point about the edge cases, and that we need to stop thinking about them as edge cases and kind of focus on them as real people.
Yeah. And I also, the idea that you just said, that they're making a choice, right? We need to start naming and claiming it as a choice, right? If you are saying, well, I'm only going to design this model that works for 80% of people, you are making a conscious choice to say, I don't care about the harm that this is causing to the other 20%. And I think people need to be held accountable for the other 20%. And the fact that they're making a choice that says this may be not intentionally designed to harm, but is not at all taking a harm reduction perspective.
Right. That's an excellent point. I think a good friend of mine who has 4 children used to say to them, before you do something, you need to say it out loud. And sometimes we just need to get them to say it out loud. So we only care about 80%, and they're the 80% that fit right here, and they're easy to count. And that's who we care about. And so we need to just teach people to say these things out loud. Before we have a few minutes before we go, and so I wanted to ask you just briefly, because we've already talked about power throughout this, and just what are you working on next in this area? Kind of where you've both talked about your research, kind of bringing it up to this point, and kind of what's next for you. I'll start with you, Apryl, and then Ifeoma.
Yeah, so I have been and am still working on this book project that I started thinking about 5 years ago. And I think that it's finally coming to a close. Things are moving in the right direction. So I think I see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the book project is called Call Me Master, Automating Sexual Racism and Online Dating. And I'm really thinking about the way that these companies are really re-entrenching sexual racism. It's not that they designed it. It's not that they really have an interest. Well, let me stop it. So they do have an interest in keeping it going, and they are disclosing it. But I think that there's this larger narrative that the companies are racist and that they are doing all of these things that make users more racist. And really it's users who are racist and our larger society who enables a particular kind of sexual racism. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which we have narrowly defined what sexual racism is. We've allowed it to be this sort of like last remaining space where it's okay to have very specific racial preferences, because we perpetuate this myth that it's just a personal choice without actually thinking through the larger implications of how we got to the personal choice. And then how the algorithms actually automate the practice of having these choices, but also conceal it. As Dr. Ajunwa was talking about, it's the same kind of process where they do it so well that they make it covert, that they're actually operationalizing people's racial bias. And then, of course, re-entrenching the larger ideas that we have about race desirability and gender in society. And so I'm working really hard to get that done. And then, of course, the workshop that I am putting together with Jenny Davis. I'm really excited about that in terms of actually trying to build reparative code together. We are going to bring together scholars, policymakers, practitioners, coders, and activists into the same space for 2 days to actually talk about what do communities need and what does reparative code look like, specifically hoping to elevate people from harmed communities and center them as community experts. I think that's something that is missing so much in sort of like tech for good work, is that we think we're the experts and actually we're not the experts. The people who are the experts are the people who are suffering the most from these technologies. And so we really want to make sure that we are centering them as experts and helping us redesign reparative code. And that's sort of generally where my work is headed.
That's great, and very consistent with kind of the area, bringing the edge cases to the middle. But I don't want to use the word edge. That's a terrible name. But Dr. Ajunwa, if you could tell us where you're going there.
Yes. So my I'm definitely continuing work in automated hiring. Same as Dr. Williams, I'm also finishing a book, The Quantified Worker, which is synthesizing all my work on emerging technologies in the workplace and looking at them from the lens of anti-discrimination law, specifically employment anti-discrimination laws, and just thinking through how these emerging technologies in the workplace are changing the employment bargain and also changing the nature and experience of work for workers and blurring lines between work and non-work. So that, that's the book project, and hopefully will be coming out next year. And then the recent article that I'm most excited about that I'm working on is actually an article that I think of as a throwback, if you will, to how racism is cyclical, especially when it comes to employment. So this article is looking at automated video interviewing, which is the newest iteration of automated hiring, but is actually hearkening back to racial discrimination that was perpetuated through the pseudoscience of phrenology.
Yes.
So, phrenology was actually a widely accepted practice in the United States at some point, mostly the 1930s. Even pre, the Nazi regime actually took some, I don't want to say inspiration, but they took some of the notions that was deployed there from the phrenology movement, which was a big movement in the United States. And part of that was really this focus on the human face, or the physiology of the human face as sort of related to human emotion, but also human character. And what you find is that automated video interviewing is hearkening back to that, because there is this sort of emphasis on facial expressions. There's an emphasis on reading emotions through body language and also facial movements. And it is gaining speed. Many employers are adopting automated video interviewing, once again, as an anti-bias intervention, because they think, okay, having an algorithm or having an automated system do the analysis is somehow more objective. But if the work of people like, Timnit, Gebru, and Joy Buolamwini has taught us anything, is that, automated facial recognition has a lot of flaws, particularly when it comes to people of color, people with darker skin. And then also several social psychologists have really questioned, Lisa Barrett is one of them, for example, have really questioned this idea of the universality of facial expressions as related to certain emotions. Yet that's really being used as part of automated video interviewing. So, I'm really excited for that paper to be published soon. It should be published early next year. It's already been accepted by the Berkeley Journal of Law and Technology. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you both taking the time, from like talking about the same idea from different areas is so helpful for us to think through kind of where work is going. And I really like this idea of focusing on possibly using technology, not only to not do harm, that we need to actually expect more from companies to be kind of innovative around this idea and trying to actually do good with their technologies and actually elevate them. So thank you very much for coming today. I really appreciate it. And I hope that everyone in our audience will join us again in 2 weeks on November 22nd. Details are through ThinkND, and we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Thank you. It's been great to be here with you all.
Thank you both.